If you're a fan of Kendrick Lamar, you know that You is one of his deepest and most personal tracks, with Kendrick at his lowest point ever, not only battling survivor's guilt, but also struggling with impostor syndrome and coming to the brink of self-destruction. On You, Kendrick is borderline suicidal, and he's caught in the middle of a depressive episode. He locks himself in a hotel room with just a bottle of liquor and starts confronting the demons that have been tearing him apart from the inside. In this video, I'm not only going to break down the lyrics of You, but also dive into Kendrick's past and his transition from growing up in Compton, surrounded by poverty and violence, to a life of fame and wealth, so we can really understand how Kendrick went from this to that. I'm Max with Hip Hop Unwrapped, and this is the real meaning behind Kendrick Lamar's song, You. Kendrick Lamar is, without a doubt, one of the greatest rappers of all time. But to many fans, he's so much more. He's a leader, a role model, and a beacon of hope. That's because Kendrick's music tackles topics like morality and religion, and he's truly mastered the art of sending a message through his songs without being preachy. Just think about his breakout hit, Swimming Pools, which at first seems like a typical party song. But when you listen closely to the lyrics, it's clear that Kendrick is actually warning us about the dangers of alcohol. And if we look at Kendrick's discography, it's pretty much all concept albums with a deeper message about life. Since he came out with Good Kid, Mad City back in 2012, Kendrick has taken that message on tours all around the world, leaving his hometown of Compton for the first time and preaching to millions of fans who live by his music. But while Kendrick was on tour, living out his wildest dreams, life in Compton continued as usual. His teenage sister got pregnant. 3 of his close childhood friends died that very summer. Kendrick would go from the tour bus to a funeral in Compton and then take a private jet to a bougie fashion party, all in the span of a couple days. This triggered an inner conflict in Kendrick, and he started asking himself, how can I preach to fans all across the world? Meanwhile, I can't even help those closest to me, my friends and my family. And it was grappling with this question that led Kendrick into a deep depression that gave us his next album, To Pimp A Butterfly, where he struggles with the guilt of leaving his old life in Compton behind, and he feels like a complete fraud. One of the very first lines on the project is, "Take a deep look inside. Are you really who they idolize?" And throughout the whole album, we hear Kendrick repeat the line, "I remember you was conflicted." And this inner conflict reaches a boiling point on the song You, where Kendrick locks himself in a hotel room with a bottle of alcohol and faces his demons head on. On You, we see Kendrick at his lowest point. He's overcome with depression and self-loathing, and he's borderline suicidal. Isolated in his hotel room with a bottle, Kendrick gets more and more intoxicated as the song goes on, until his subconscious completely takes over and starts attacking him, calling him a fraud, a hypocrite, and a failure. And this isn't just some scene that Kendrick thought up. This song was inspired by an actual event that happened while Kendrick was touring with Kanye for the Yeezus tour. It was just a year after Kendrick dropped his breakthrough album, Good Kid, Mad City, and he was quickly rising to the top of the rap game. Wealth and fame were completely new to Kendrick. Just a few months before, he was the good kid stuck in the Mad City, and now here he was surrounded by everything he'd ever dreamed of. Kendrick had, without a doubt, made it. He escaped from Compton and was getting his first taste of his new life. He even got baptized to mark his transition into stardom, and things were finally looking up. Until he started getting the calls that brought him right back into the harsh reality of life in Compton. In an interview with MTV, Kendrick spoke on being pulled back into the chaos going on at home while he was on tour.
I gotta get off stage and almost face the madness and get these calls, you feel me? Like, it's real, man. 3 of my homeboys that summertime, was murdered. Right. You know, close ones too, not just somebody that I hear about. These people I grow up with. So, it all psychologically, it messes your brain up because you live in this life, you know what I'm saying? But you still have to face realities of this. I gotta get back off that tour bus and go to these funerals.
And sometime during the Yeezus tour, Kendrick snapped. He locked himself in a hotel room and started screaming. And before we dive into the lyrics, in order to really understand how Kendrick even got to this point, it's really important to talk about Kendrick's past and what his life was like growing up in Compton. Kendrick's parents left the south side of Chicago in 1984, and they moved to Compton to escape gang violence with just $500 to their name. Young Kendrick was born a few years later, and despite his parents' best efforts, he grew up in Compton in the 80s and 90s surrounded by poverty and gang activity. Kendrick saw his first murder victim when he was 5, when a teenage drug dealer was gunned down outside of his apartment building. When he was 8, he saw his second murder while walking home from elementary school. His uncle Tony, who Kendrick mentions on Money Trees, was also shot in the head at a burger stand when Kendrick was a kid. And at this point, Kendrick was completely numb to the violence going on around him. By the time he got to high school, Kendrick was running with a bad crowd. The same crew he raps about doing home invasions and running from cops with on Good Kid, Mad City. Rather than a stranger, now it was his friends who were becoming victims of gang violence. One time, his mom found a bloody hospital gown that Kendrick kept after going to the emergency room with a friend who got shot. Another time, she found him curled up weeping in the front yard of their home after Kendrick was shot at. But it wasn't just gangs that were threatening Kendrick's life. Kendrick also had to worry about the police, which he calls the biggest gang in California. He had police pull guns on him a couple times. Once, when he was 17, cruising through Compton with a friend. A cop saw the flashy green Camaro they were riding in and pulled them over. When his friend couldn't find his license fast enough, the cop put a gun to his head. Kendrick spoke about the situation to Rolling Stone, saying, "I remember driving off in silence, feeling violated, and him being so angry a tear dropped from his eye." But his other friends weren't as lucky. In 2007, LAPD responded to a call 5 minutes from Kendrick's house. When they got there, they opened fire on his good friend and shot him to death, claiming that he was holding a 10-inch knife. But Kendrick says their story didn't add up. With all this going on around him, Kendrick says he escaped that fate thanks to his family, faith, and hip-hop. When asked if he thought he had a good chance of making it as a rapper, Kendrick told The Guardian, "It just depended on what type of day it was. If it was a day when I'm doing something constructive, like being in the studio, yeah, I may feel like I can make it. But if it's a day when I'm just hanging out and somebody drives by, starts shooting, and the bullet barely misses me but it hits the homie and kills him, I don't feel like that anymore. I'm back to reality." So some days I did, some days I didn't, but there were more days I didn't. When Kendrick finally did make it, culture shock hit him hard. He grew up on food stamps in Section 8 housing. From preschool to 12th grade, there wasn't a single white person in his classroom. Before he started touring, he had barely left Compton. Now, suddenly at age 25, Kendrick was thrown into a completely different life, telling Rolling Stone, "You're around people you don't know how to communicate with. You don't speak the same lingo. It brings confusion and insecurity, questioning, how did I get here? What am I doing?" So while Good Kid, Mad City took us through a day in the life of teenage Kendrick in Compton, dodging bullets from rival gangs and narrowly escaping police officers, T-Pab takes us through his transition from a life of poverty and violence to his new life of fame and wealth. Or, in Kendrick's terms, his transformation from cocoon to butterfly. And you can actually see this idea expressed on the cover of T-Pab, which has Kendrick and his friends clutching 40s in front of the White House, representing a meeting of two cultures, a crossroads of Kendrick's old life and his new reality, where he was now going to dinners at Obama's White House and becoming a celebrity, but most importantly, a voice for his community. But when we get into the lyrics of You, we see that this transition deeply affected Kendrick's mental health, causing him to suffer from depression caused by feelings of survivor's guilt and impostor syndrome. Speaking on the song You, Kendrick told The Guardian, "It was something that just accumulated. You know when you get bad news after bad news after bad news, and you can't express this to anybody, but you gotta relive it in some type of way? I was able to bottle that moment and put it on record." And we hear that moment at the very beginning of the song, which starts with Kendrick screaming, followed by the chorus, on which Kendrick repeats the phrase, "Loving you is complicated." And it's clear that Kendrick is speaking directly to himself, judging himself almost like an outsider looking in, which is how many of us experience depression and anxiety, like some hostile voice aggressively telling us everything we think is wrong with ourselves. But Kendrick's depression isn't just some vague sadness. He goes into detail on the things that have been weighing on his mind, starting with his intense feeling of shame. Kendrick starts the first verse by telling us that he feels ashamed that he isn't there to support his family while they deal with the hardships of life in Compton. Regardless of the fact that he has the big house with the marble floors, which is a testament to his wealth, His confidence in himself is at an all-time low. And at the same time, his fans, or as Kendrick calls them, anonymous strangers, idolize Kendrick as a role model, and for good reason. Other than his incredible music, Kendrick rarely drinks and he doesn't do any other drugs. He's religious, he doesn't wear fancy clothes or jewelry, and he recently had his first kid with his high school sweetheart. According to K-Dot, his biggest vices are constantly recording music, watching the TV show Martin, and eating his favorite food, Fruity Pebbles. Meanwhile, he feels like he's failing those who are most important to him. Kendrick breaks it down in the next lines, where he talks about his little sister, who got pregnant as a teenager. Not only does he feel responsible, but Kendrick feels like a fraud because he's preaching to his fans through his socially conscious music, while his younger sister is still making these kinds of mistakes. And Kendrick blames himself for not being a bigger influence in her life, which he believes is one of the reasons she ended up pregnant as a teenage girl. Kendrick describes this inner conflict in an interview with MTV.
From my sister to my little cousins and to other siblings around me that's coming up. How can I be a voice for all these people around the world and can't reach them like I want to? And they're the closest to me. That's a trip. For me personally, somebody else's mistake, I tend to fault myself.
And in the next lines, we start to see Kendrick really grapple with what's called impostor syndrome, which is when people believe that they don't deserve their success or leadership role, thinking that others have somehow been tricked into believing that they're worthy, regardless of any proof to the contrary. And think about this, about 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. One survey from the Harvard Business Review asked 116 CEOs and executives about their biggest fear, and the number one answer was that they were afraid to be found out to be incompetent. And the same goes for famous people, even those considered to be the best at what they do. For example, Albert Einstein had the same issue, calling himself an involuntary swindler and saying his work didn't deserve the attention it received. And Kendrick suffers from the same thing, telling The Guardian that one of his biggest internal battles is embracing leadership, saying, "You got it whether you want it or not, because you have thousands of people singing your songs every night. Your friends at the side of the stage, they're looking at you as somebody who made it. They're following you, and every mistake you make, they're gonna make the same mistakes." And Kendrick knows that fans all around the world live by his music. And in many cases, he's the closest thing to a preacher they have, with kids at shows telling him they were gonna kill themselves until they heard Good Kid, Mad City, and showing him scars they got from cutting themselves as proof. But the issue is that Kendrick doesn't view himself as a role model. He feels like a hypocrite, speaking for the streets of Compton while being so far removed from his hometown, where his closest friends are dying and his teenage sister is getting pregnant. Meanwhile, he's out touring the country. And just think about what happens on These Walls, the song right before You, where Kendrick uses his status as a successful rapper to get back at a rival who's in prison by sleeping with the man's wife. Later in the album, on Mortal Man, Kendrick addresses this directly, saying, "As I lead this army of fans, make room for mistakes and depression." On top of all of that, self-esteem became one of Kendrick's biggest challenges during this time, with him having a hard time accepting that he deserved to be where he was. And some of that came from his culture shock, from being outside of Compton and around white people who came from very different backgrounds for the first time in his life. And this is actually a common cause of imposter syndrome, according to imposter syndrome expert Valerie Young, who told Time magazine, "The more people who look or sound like you, the more confident you feel. And conversely, the fewer people who look or sound like you, it can and does for many people impact their confidence." She says this is especially true whenever you belong to a group for whom there are stereotypes about competence. So how is it that people like Kendrick and Einstein feel like imposters despite their obvious success? It goes back to what's called pluralistic ignorance. The fact that we all doubt ourselves privately, but at the same time we think we're the only ones who do this because nobody voices these thoughts. And this is specific to imposter syndrome because one of the main fears is being uncovered as a fraud, meaning people really don't open up about it. So we think we're alone in seeing ourselves as imposters since there's really no way to know if others are going through the same thing or how qualified they actually are. And this is exactly why Kendrick sharing that he suffers from imposter syndrome on You is so powerful. We know that giving someone with imposter syndrome positive feedback doesn't help. Like Kendrick says, numbers lie too. No amount of success or critical acclaim or even a Pulitzer Prize win is enough to convince someone with imposter syndrome that they are worthy of their achievements. What does help is hearing that other accomplished people you respect feel like imposters too. So even though he thinks he's failing, by sharing his experience with imposter syndrome, Kendrick actually is helping others who feel the same way to know they aren't alone. And it's especially impactful coming from someone like Kendrick, who's universally considered one of the greatest rappers ever. But Kendrick has bigger demons haunting him, specifically survivor's guilt. He goes on to set the scene for what actually happened that day on the Yeezus tour. Locked in the hotel room, his alcohol-fueled rant, full of self-hatred, is interrupted by a cleaning lady knocking at the door. And rather than snapping him out of it, Kendrick ignores her calls and gets right to the root of his pain: survivor's guilt. Kendrick explains that not only does he feel guilty for leaving his community, but he also moved his family out of Compton, which causes tension between him and other relatives and longtime friends. Then we hear Kendrick say, "Where was your antennas?" something that he repeats throughout the song. And the term antennas plays on the album's theme, since butterflies use antennas to sense their surroundings. Kendrick is essentially accusing himself of being completely disconnected from the problems people are dealing with in Compton while he rose to stardom. And he also accuses himself of leaving Compton for profit. While Kendrick was busy becoming rich and famous off of his music on tour, ordinary people in Compton were still dying, including his best friend's little brother Chad, who Kendrick promised to watch over while Chad's older brother was in prison. Chad ended up getting shot in a drive-by while Kendrick was on tour overseas. And Kendrick didn't visit Chad in the hospital, thinking he would be fine. But Chad died in his third surgery due to blood loss a month after the shooting. And Kendrick holds a lot of guilt for not going to see his dying friend in person, although he did FaceTime him once, which Kendrick views as pathetic. Kendrick felt so much responsibility for Chad's death because he promised Chad's older brother to keep him safe. And you can literally hear Kendrick sniffling and sobbing throughout the second half of the song. And what Kendrick is dealing with here is called survivor's guilt, a condition which Kendrick actually name drops on the song Hood Politics. And when I looked into survivor's guilt, I realized that almost every symptom is mentioned by Kendrick on You in one way or another. So what is survivor's guilt? Survivor's guilt is a type of guilt that can happen after a traumatic event, when people feel guilty for surviving or avoiding some type of harm when others don't. The concept first became known in the 60s when psychologists spoke with survivors of the Holocaust. Since then, it's been seen in a wide range of situations, from people who lived through a car crash or a mass shooting to someone feeling guilty for not being there when a loved one dies. And it's very common, with one study finding that 90% of participants who survived an event when others didn't had feelings of guilt. So you might be wondering, what does survivor's guilt actually feel like? Patience Carter was shot in the leg at Pulse nightclub in Florida, the second deadliest mass shooting in the United States. And as she recovered, she wrote a poem describing the devastating feelings of survivor's guilt, saying,
"The guilt of feeling lucky to be alive is heavy. It's like the weight of the ocean's walls crushing uncontrolled by levees."
When someone has survivor's guilt, they often wonder why they survived while others didn't. In other cases, their pain stems from the fact that they think they could have done something different to prevent those who died from being killed, especially when someone feels a sense of responsibility for the person who passed, like Kendrick does for Chad. They might replay the events that took place over and over and think about the things they could have or should have done that they think would have changed the outcome. And this rehashing of events can often worsen feelings of guilt, especially if people feel that their own actions or inactions might be to blame. They might even realize that there was nothing they could have done to prevent someone's death, but struggle to come to terms with that, as trauma warps the way they see the world and themselves in it. And in many cases, this is influenced by what's known as hindsight bias. People look back and they overestimate their ability to have known the outcome of an event. But because they feel like they should have predicted what happened, they also become convinced that they should have been able to change the outcome, and they feel guilty for not doing so. Especially if the person is spiritual, it's common for them to feel like they're being judged by God for what happened. and Kendrick literally says that line about God judging him for failing his murdered friend. According to Courtney Armstrong, a clinical hypnotherapist that specializes in grief and trauma recovery, shame is also often intertwined with survivor's guilt, saying when there's an element of survivor's guilt on top of grief, they feel ashamed or guilty for having any joy. She says clients have told her, "I can't be happy if my loved one isn't here. I feel bad for enjoying my life when they're not here." And this explains why we hear Kendrick constantly struggling to enjoy his new life of fame and wealth. And in the very next lines, we see Kendrick accusing himself of having his antennas focused on partying and chasing his dreams of being a rapper, rather than thinking of his close ones in Compton. This tension between Kendrick's career and his desire to help his loved ones back in Compton was ripping him apart. Right after Chad's memorial service, Kendrick flew straight to a show in Alaska. The next stop was Vegas, where he performed at a pool party. Kendrick spoke on how all of this was affecting him in an interview with MTV, saying,
And when I was on that tour bus and things is happening back home in my city or in my family that I can't do nothing about, it's out of my control, I can put it in God's hands, I couldn't understand that. And that can draw a thin line, between you having your sanity and you losing it.
Kendrick felt like he should have been in Compton with his family, going through the hardships and dealing with the loss like he did on Sing About Me when he was holding Dave's dying brother in his arms. Instead, he was on stage, preaching to fans. Not only did Kendrick feel like he deserted the people he loves in Compton, but being away from them left him feeling deserted and isolated in a new, unfamiliar world of fame and wealth. His surroundings completely changed, and he could no longer connect with his old home, his old way of life, and his old friends, or even his family in the same way. Throughout this whole episode in the hotel room, Kendrick is drowning his pain in alcohol, and by now, he's completely drunk. This lets his subconscious speak freely, not only listing all the things he finds wrong with himself, but also highlighting the disconnect between his old and his new life. Kendrick hasn't been speaking to his old friends to the point where he feels like they're beefing because they think he's changed up. But Kendrick sees it differently, telling XXL, "It's almost like you go on the road and you're gone for 2 years, and this place you've known your whole life, these people you've known your whole life, everything is different when you come back. The artist doesn't necessarily change. It's usually the people around them. Their expectations of you can sometimes be out of control. You can do one thing that can trigger something mentally in them that makes them think that you don't care about them or you don't fuck with them no more, when that's not the case. You're just more focused on what you have to do because it's bigger." In the next lines, Kendrick's subconscious threatens to reveal secrets from his past to the world. But every time he's about to spill the beans, Kendrick takes a gulp of alcohol to shut himself up. Like many people who abuse alcohol, Kendrick drinks to bury his secrets and be numb to those painful thoughts. And this could be guilt about something he's done in the past, like the crimes he rapped about doing with his homies on Good Kid, Mad City. But based on the next lyrics, Kendrick might actually be referencing a past suicide attempt. While Kendrick's subconscious recognizes that he's beyond messed up from the alcohol, it claims it's not as messed up as Kendrick himself, and then says that he should have ended his own life a long time ago. Kendrick ends the song by saying that if he told the world his secrets, the world would know that money truly isn't everything, because despite it, Kendrick is depressed and suicidal. And it makes sense that he feels this way, because survivor's guilt is strongly linked to suicidal tendencies. And in the DSM-5, the main book used by medical professionals to diagnose psychiatric disorders, survivor's guilt is technically considered a symptom of PTSD. And one of the symptoms of PTSD is that people start to feel detached from the world around them, which explains why Kendrick locks himself in his hotel room during this episode. And even though Kendrick wasn't there when his friends were shot, he still has PTSD from his time in Compton. On some level, Kendrick believes that he survived by escaping Compton while others weren't as lucky, which makes him feel extremely guilty. And this also ties into Kendrick's feelings of being an impostor. Kendrick feels like he didn't deserve to be the one to make it out of Compton, like he dreamed of on the song Black Boy Fly. Kendrick even told The Guardian, "A lot of my homeboys were getting killed, a lot of them going to jail. I was put in a lot of situations I still to this day can't figure out why I wasn't in the same position as the victim." And just like with imposter syndrome, people who suffer from survivor's guilt don't always know that's what they're dealing with. So hearing Kendrick voice his own experience with survivor's guilt is powerful. People who suffer from survivor's guilt usually recognize that they feel angry, depressed, or anxious, but it's so much more difficult to realize that guilt is the underlying cause of these feelings. And that's because admitting that we feel guilty over a tragic event is extremely painful, since guilt is deeply tied to feelings of shame and our sense of self-worth. So Kendrick sharing his struggles with imposter syndrome and survivor's guilt is incredibly powerful, because these are conditions that people rarely talk about, since nobody wants to admit feeling guilty or feeling like a fraud. Because these are rarely discussed, people often have no idea they're suffering from these problems, even when symptoms like depression come up. So Kendrick bringing these issues to light really helps people understand what they themselves are going through. And knowing that someone else, especially someone as accomplished as Kendrick, also has these struggles makes people feel less alone. If there's any silver lining to this song, that's about it, because there's no moment on You where Kendrick comes anywhere close to resolving these issues and defeating his demons. There's no moment where Kendrick is consoled and told it's all gonna be okay. There's nobody to tell him how great he is and try to convince him that he shouldn't feel like an imposter. He has no loved ones around to reason with him and convince him that he couldn't possibly have done anything to prevent Chad's death, and he shouldn't blame himself for that or for his sister getting pregnant. And I really think this showcases the loneliness of fame and how deserted Kendrick felt during this period of change, and how his depression almost drove him to suicide because he had no outlet for his feelings. But rather than taking his own life, Kendrick is able to overcome the dread he feels by putting it into the song and working through those feelings with his music in a therapeutic way that allows him to process his feelings and move on from them. Not in a way that he no longer feels a sense of responsibility for his loved ones in Compton, but in a way that he can find a balance between his old and new life without being ripped apart. And we can see this growth in the very next song, where he lets us know that regardless of how dark things might get for Kendrick or for his legion of fans, we gon' be alright. And that's the real meaning behind Kendrick Lamar's You. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something from this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more breakdowns like this one, and let me know what song or artist I should cover next in the comments. And if you want to see sources for everything I talked about in this video and all the images I used, you can check the description for a link to my website, and my social media accounts are linked there too. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next Monday with a brand new video breaking down the song 2009 by the one and only Mac Miller.